It's time to add backing and binding to the Automaker's bench pillow. I'm ready to add the backing and stitch in the ditch for my Automaker's bench pillow. And normally I leave the stabilizer on the outside edges until after I've done that step and I'm ready to put my binding on. Then I will cut this edge clean, and that just helps with any fraying as I'm working with the bench pillow. I'm going to be doing something a little bit different with this pillow, or for me it's a wall hanging, and so I need to trim off this stabilizer before I stitch in the ditch with the backing. So what I'm going to do that is different is I am going to be using the backing fabric, which is the same brown polka dot fabric. I'm going to use that as the backing and the binding. And I'm not going to cut binding strips. I am going to self bind, which means I will cut the backing a little bit larger. I will go ahead and stitch in the ditch and attach that, because again, I'm making mine into a wall hanging and not the bench pillow. And then I will fold that extra fabric over to make the binding. So I first need to trim off the stabilizer, and that's of course super simple. I will just take my ruler, line it up, and I don't automatically go to the edge of my fabric just in case I've not sewn exactly straight or haven't cut exactly straight. I've tried to keep this as square as I can as I've stitched and put this together. But what I'm going to do is line this up with the edge, and it looks like I am 3 1/4 inch to the seam allowance that goes between this border, or the outer border, and the inner border. And so I want to make sure that I am lined up at that 3 1/4 all the way down when I cut, as close as I can. And I may have a little bit of extra stabilizer hanging off, and that should be fine. If I cut this bottom piece to start, if I'm on my 3 1/4, and actually let me double check because I've got my ruler flipped around. I always have the sticker to the upper right, and so I always want to do that so that I am measuring the same way, and it does still equal 3 1/4, but I wanted to double check that. All right, so if I trim, it looks like I am pretty right on. If I get, again, a little bit that has a little bit of stabilizer over, or if I cut a little tiny bit of the fabric, I'm good with that, because I want to be equal and straight with this inner border. All right, so that's what I'm going to do for the top and the bottom, and then we'll move on to putting the backing on. So I have the stabilizer trimmed off, and I have my backing just laid with the right side down, and I've put my quilt on top, and I do not add an extra layer of batting. Now you could easily do that by cutting batting a little bit larger and doing the stitch in the ditch and trimming that batting, or if you're going to try what I'm going to do, which is the self binding, you would want to cut your batting pretty much the same size, because when I stitch in the ditch, I'm going to go right up to the edge, and I'm not going to be cutting the excess off. Normally, on all the bench pillows that I've turned into wall hangings, I would put my backing on, do all of the stitch in the ditch, and then trim off all of the excess so that I have the backing the same size as the quilt top. But again, I'm going to be doing that different. So I have just laid the quilt basically in the center of my background fabric, and I'm just going to make sure that I'm about even top to bottom and then left to right, having at least a couple of inches. And that will give me plenty to stitch in the ditch, and once this is all put together, I'll be able to trim up the fabric to the exact size that I need it. So the first thing I'm going to do is place a couple of pins, and when I do it on a wall hanging this size, I usually just put pins in one place in the main blocks and then a couple of places on the outer border, just enough to keep my backing together. And then as I stitch in the ditch, I will just make sure that that is as flat as can be, the backing. Now I'm also going to be using the clear monofilament thread and a bobbin with clear monofilament thread. All right, so let's go ahead and get to the machine. I'm ready to stitch in the ditch, and I am using my monopoly clear thread. I have a thread net, and I have this just sitting off to the side of my machine, and I have it coming up the top and looped kind of behind where I would wind the bobbin. It's similar to how I thread metallic thread when I'm using my embroidery machine. And then it just comes across and then is threaded normal. And that's what I find works for me instead of using a thread stand. So what I'm going to do also is use an open toe foot. Now I used to use the stitch in the ditch foot that has a guide right in the center, and I did that for a while, but I found that the guide kind of wobbled depending on, you know, how you were holding the quilt, and so it's also easier to see on a video with the open toe. So I switched to an open toe, and this is one time where I do watch my needle. When you sew, typically you're not supposed to watch your needle. This is different because we're stitching in the ditch and we need to watch the needle. So I've also increased my stitch length to 3.5 millimeters, and I am just going to stitch right along the seam. I am going to reverse at the beginning and at the end before I cut off. I'm going to start with these center blocks. I'll start on this one by the truck. I just picked one that was kind of in the middle, and I'll work my way to the right, and then I'll turn it around and do the last few that are to my left right now. Then I will do the inner border, top and bottom, and then the inner border, top and bottom, and then finally all of the little patchwork for the outer border. All right, and I'll just try to keep things as smooth as I can. You can see I have a couple of pins, not a whole lot. It just kind of keeps it together, and I'll keep making sure that that's flat as possible. All right, let's get started. I'm going to sew a little bit real time so you can see how fast I go, which isn't fast at all for stitching in the ditch. I do go pretty slow because I want it in the ditch as much as possible, and so I don't really go all that fast. And I usually will use my hand wheel and put the needle down at the start and make sure I'm right in the middle, and then I will just stitch. And again, with the open toe, you can see right where the needle goes, and so I really like the open toe foot. So this is about as fast as I go. And then when I come up to this inner border, I will back stitch and forward, and then I have my machine of course set to cut the thread, and all I have to do is push this once and it will do the 3 back stitches. I have that all set up. All right. So I've got all the stitch in the ditch done, and you can see on the back here is one that's in that center block, and then here's the inner border, and you can see how good it looks. All right, so now I'm going to change my thread. I'm going to use the brown thread, the same that I used for the quilting on the inner border that blends super well with this. I'm going to use that to stitch around the outside, because right now all of the ends, like the last block and all the edges of the outer border between where I stitched in the ditch, are all open, and I want to go ahead and just make a stitch about 1/8 of an inch all around to keep these together. All right, so I'm going to go do that, and I'm going to just do that with regular brown thread. So I've done all my stitch in the ditch, and I stitched around the entire perimeter with the dark brown thread. And now what I need to do is cut this fabric, the backing that will become the binding, to 1 inch past my quilt. And so I've lined up the 1 inch mark on my ruler, and using some other marks or seams on my quilt top to make sure I'm as straight as I can be. So down at the bottom, I have that lined up. Now my marks don't match exactly with the inner border, but I can see that they're pretty straight. And then up here, the same thing. I have this lined up with the border, and that looks good. So I'm about as straight as I can get. So I'm just going to cut this 1 inch. And that will become my binding when I fold it and then fold it over. All right, so I will just do that around the entire quilt. Now that I have everything trimmed to 1 inch, I am simply going to fold the edge of my binding or backing. I'm going to fold it in half so that it meets the edge of my quilt. And then I will fold it over again, and that will become my binding. Now, I think I am going to not clip everything. Sometimes when you clip, you still have to remove them and kind of straighten things out. So I think what I'll do is when I start, I'll probably start in the bottom left. I'll probably just clip it to get going, and then I'm going to try just to fold as I stitch. Now when I come to a corner, it's really like any other binding, other than you need to make that first fold. So if I'm coming along sewing this, and there's the first fold, and then I would fold it over again. Now this is where I'll probably stop and use clips. And then I would be sewing it like this, and so I would continue the fold all the way down. Let me find a clip. The only one I have right here are these these big clips. But that would be sewn down, and that will come straight. And then to make a nice mitered corner, I will take this folded edge and fold it up along the side of the quilt. And you could always take a stiletto or something if you wanted to hold that right there, or your finger, and put that fold right along the side of the quilt. I know it's hard to see with the brown, but it's just a 90-degree angle. And then you would continue. So this would need to be folded in half. And what I would probably do is, again, put a little tiny clip, not these big quilting clips. But now that it's folded, I would need to fold this edge up to the side of the quilt. So it would look like that. And then just fold over like I did at the start. Now here is where I will just need to kind of finesse that corner so that the corner of the new side, the fold, is lining up the best it can with the fold from the first side. And there is, you know, quite a bit of bulk because we have this folded over, now we have this folded over, but it makes for a really nice corner. And then I would just continue. So what I would do is take my regular clips and clip that when I had a nice corner. I would probably stop maybe 4 inches back to give myself room to do this. And then I would just sew down as normal, catch into this new side right in the corner where that miter meets, pivot, and then keep sewing. So that's how I'm going to do this entire binding, and I think it looks great. So let's get started on sewing this. I wanted to mention a couple of other things. If you want a smaller binding, because this will be about 1/2 inch, then you would just need to cut your border that extends just a little bit smaller. So I have 1 inch, and so half of that will be what is exposed. If you wanted it smaller, you could maybe cut this to 3/4 of an inch, and then when you fold it in half and in half again, you will be slightly under 1/2 inch. So just whatever, if there's a certain size you want the finished binding to be, just double that and cut the width of your background fabric. Now for the stitch length, I am going to use a 3mm, and I am using my stitch in the ditch foot for the binding, and I'll show you how I'm going to set that up, but I need to move my needle. So the first thing I'm going to do is, on my machine I have the Baby Lock Soprano, which I love. I need to select this little notebook piece of paper that's for my settings, and then I just go down and I can use this width control 2 different ways. When I have it off, then these buttons determine how fast or slow my machine will go. If I have it on the slowest, even if I have my foot pedal pressed all the way down, the machine will only go so fast. Same thing for medium and fast. I usually keep mine on medium. But when I change this to on, when I change this to on, then this button becomes a left and right needle mover. So I can move my needle to the left or the right, just, you know, notch by notch. And so what I'm going to do is, right now I have my guide foot on. It's that center guide that I'm going to ride right along the fold. But of course I need to move my needle to the right, or I'll just stitch off and it would be like stitching in the ditch. So I am just going to move until I see, you know, I never have a set amount. I just kind of look at it and see what I think looks good. I'm going to put my needle down, and I think that looks good. So I don't know how many notches I moved it over. You can see it's just not quite in the center. It was between those two. All right, so let me show you a close-up of the presser foot. So here is that stitch in the ditch foot. So this is a guide, and I am going to ride it just to the left of the fold of my binding. And because I move my needle to the right, it will stitch, of course, the binding down. And so I want to keep this binding as even as I can and stitch. So I'm just going to go slow. I'm going to see how that looks. So you can see I have this guide right along the fold. And then I will just fold it a little bit at a time. I think that's going to be my best bet. So let's, and I just have my dark brown thread. And I think that looks good as far as the amount away from the fold. So I'm just going to continue a little bit longer before I fold my corner and clip it. And I like this guide because if you have things folded even, it gives the same amount and gives a really good top stitch. All right, so I'm at a good point where I'm going to fold my corner. So I have it again folded over to the end of the quilt and then fold it again. And I have it all the way to the bottom. So now I'm going to take this fold and just make a 90-degree angle and line it up right with the side of the quilt. I'm just going to use my finger to hold it. You could again use a stylus or stiletto. And so then it's just folded up 90 degrees and then you have like a 45-degree right here. Now I'm going to take just for a minute and kind of clip this end so it stays, because now I need to fold this in half and then in half again. Now I didn't pre-press. I tried that on a section since this is a new technique for me, the self-binding, and it was good for the first fold, you know, to press that, but then when you fold over, that crease that you pressed in didn't always sit right at the end where it needed to be. So I found that it didn't work as well. So I folded this in half and in half again. Now I am going to clip down here to hold this, and then I'm going to kind of adjust my corner to make sure that, let me get my seam ripper, that this point of the corner lines up with this fold. And sometimes again you need to, you know, manipulate it. It doesn't always just fold right over. So where I folded this fabric into the 90-degree angle, I think I'm going to press my little seam ripper to kind of hold that, and I'm just going to fold this up. And you can see right now it's, I think you can see it's a little bit far back. And so if I kind of loosen it, or not loosen it, but lift, and that makes a better join. I want those folds to join as closely as possible. And so now I've got a really nice miter. I am going to keep this clipped. In fact, I think I'm going to clip it again, just so that I can get this sewn and turned, and then I will just fold as I go. So I think that corner looks really good. So I'll continue to sew. Whoops. Now I want to try to get my needle right in the corner of that corner. So I will just go slow. Now I do have the guide that now needs to go over the fabric, and so it should be okay. And I will just look and go slow until I can hopefully see. That's the only downside to this kind of foot, is that it's hard to see when you get to the corner. right, so I think I'm going to pivot. I think I'm in a good spot. I don't have it set. And if I pivot, I can see that my guide is right where I need to be. And so I think I'm good. So I will continue. And so you can see right here how that looks pretty good. I think I got a little close because that foot, again, it's hard to see. So I got a little bit closer to the fold than I did everywhere else, but luckily the thread blends, so I'm going to call that good. So I'm going to continue on this side. And then I'll just continue to fold. And then fold in half. And I want to snug this fold up to the side of the quilt. And then I'll keep going. So I'm back to the start. I'm starting right here and you can see how nice that looks. And so I just need to do the same thing, just continue to fold in and then fold over. And I did find it useful to use a couple of clips at a time. All right, so I will continue with this. Now I do want to say that I think when I was folding, I started and had a much better fold. And some of the places I felt like I wasn't quite super snug, I guess, to the end of the quilt. And so my binding might be a little bit bigger. But this is the first time I've done this. I really liked this way. And so I think I'm going to do this again. So I'll just finish. And I didn't reverse when I started this. So what I'm going to do is just stitch over, I don't know, maybe a half of an inch, and then cut that, and hopefully I can line that up. All right, so I've just got a few inches left. Okay, I wasn't exactly perfect, but pretty good. Let's go take a look. So here is the binding on, and I really love it. Now I did learn, you know, doing this, and I would definitely do this again. I really liked the self-binding. So you can see though that where I started, there's kind of a dip. I had it really folded nice because, you know, nothing else was folded and clipped or anything. And you can see how small that is, and it kind of dips down where I ended up not folding the other ones quite as tight. I found that folding it as I go, I kind of learned, you know, halfway through that I needed to fold it much farther in advance than I thought, because I think on some of these I didn't get it quite as tight as you can see. But overall I really like it. I think it looks good. You can see that using that guide foot I have a pretty consistent top stitch. You know, not perfect, but I really like it. Here's the corner. So again, I did my best without being able to see on that foot, coming here where I could see the guide, and then you could tell it goes down a little bit. I kind of veered off, but with that being said, I think the corners look great. I am really happy with this, and I think, you know, the more I do this, probably I'll get, of course, better, and I'll find a way that works the best. Now on the back, there are 2 rows of stitching, and that is because this very first inner row is where I tacked my quilt top. Remember, after I had done all the stitch in the ditch, all of the ends were open, and so I wanted that to be tacked down. So that's what this very inner stitch is, and then of course this outer stitch is what I just stitched for the top stitch. But I am really happy with this. I think it looks good. It was, you know, relatively easy, and I learned a lot. I think it looks great. I may in the future fold it and fold it again and then press, and maybe even glue based. I think glue basting would be a great option, because this was super easy to do, but that would give more consistent results and you could get everything, you know, lined up. But I am really happy with it. Now I need to put on some ties to hang this, because normally when I do binding and I attach my binding strips and flip it to the back, I can sew my little hanging tabs. That wasn't, of course, an option with the way I did it. So I am just going to get my hanging tabs done, and I'm just going to stitch them on the back. So let me go grab those. For the ties, I'm also going to try something new. Now, I have just these little ponytail holders. They're just, you know, for ponytails. And I am going to use this so that I can have a loop to hang where I hang my quilts. I'm lining it up right with the seam of the first 2 pieces of the outer border. And I probably have a hair less than half showing. I haven't cut it or anything. I have the loop, and I'm not sure I'm going to cut it. It kind of depends. This is the back, and no one is really going to see that. But I need to stitch right over the top stitching for the binding to hold that in place, and I'll go back and forth a couple of times. So how I did that was just, you know, pinch it in half, and I have my seam right here, and so and then because I don't have any fabric ties, I'll show you what I'm going to do to make this look super cute. All right, that looks about even. I might move it over. I think I'm off center just a hair. Okay. So I will go just again stitch over that. To catch that. Try to make it as even as I can. And then I think what I'm going to do is something totally different. I've never done anything like this for any of my wall hangings, and I thought it might be fun, is I have these strips from, you know, cutting off around the backing, and I think I'm just going to pull some fabrics that I have, some longer pieces, maybe this blue and the yellow. I'll just pick several, and I think I'm just going to rip them, and I don't want them to be perfect. In fact, I would like them to fray, and then I'm just going to kind of tie a knot, and so it'll just be kind of loose, and I think that'll be cute. So let me pick some fabrics, and then let's see what this looks like. Okay, so I just picked some of the fabrics, and I think I'm going to use one piece of this brown. So what I think I'm going to do is, I don't want them too thick since I'm using several pieces. I'm going to try about half of what this is. This one I'm just going to rip the whole thing because I can't do anything else with this. Okay. And I'll probably take off some of the threads I don't want, but I like the fraying, so I'll worry about that. There's two pieces. And then I think I'll just cut. Okay, so let me go put these aside. I'm going to go sew those on and sew my remaining buttons. I have a few more buttons to sew on, and then I'll come back and show you how I'm going to do the ties, and we'll be done. So the first thing I need to do is move my needle back to the center, and so I need to move this right to the center of these two, and then I need to go ahead and turn the width control off, just because I don't leave it on so that I can use this for my speed. So now I'm just going to stitch over that little ponytail holder. So I am going to just drop my needle to make sure I'm right in line as good as I can be. I do have an open toe. I changed my foot so that I could see right, you know, over the stitching. And so I'm just going to go forward and back. I am going to go ahead and back stitch, and I'll just watch and go right over that same. I want to keep those together, that same stitching. And so that's on, and it's right over the same stitching. That'll be covered up with my little ties that I cut. So let's do this next one. All right, so those are both on. So now I'm going to get my little button foot and put the last two buttons on, and then we can go put the ties on. So I am using my button foot. I have it already in, and this little prong on the bottom holds that. This little clear lever I have pushed all the way back so that it doesn't have that little bar coming out, because I want this to be flat on my quilt. And I'm going to, then put it in my machine and adjust if I need to. The little holes should line up the center with the little red dots. And then I always check it with my hand wheel. But let me change my screen. I need to put the buttonhole stitch on. So this is the same as the others. I need to choose this little menu, this little icon, and then I'm using stitch 90 on my machine. So I look for that icon, it's the second one on my screen, and I will select that, and now I need 90. And it will tell me, this is a little icon, it's kind of hard to see, but that's what this icon is. It's stitch 90, I need the M foot, and it's the button. Now you'll notice that there's nothing to change here because it's a set. It's basically a decorative stitch, even though it's just putting on a button. It will do so many stitches and then tie off, and that will be one series of this, quote, decorative stitch. All right, so let's go back and put the button on. Okay, I think that's where I'm going to put my button, and I always turn the hand wheel to make sure I'm going to clear the holes and that I have things set up and that I haven't, gotten them askew. I do always have to usually adjust. Even though I put my button on first, it's still easier to have to do that and then put the foot on for me. So I always put that on and then kind of adjust it after I've gotten everything on. So when I do the hand wheel, I can already tell I need to go over just a little bit. It starts, that's part of that series of stitches. And so I could do this whole thing by turning my hand wheel, and it would eventually do the locking, and then I would know it was over. But I'm going to see, this is pretty tight. Okay, so I think that's good. Now I forgot to mention that I took my foot pedal out. I usually just use my start stop button, but I am going to change to slow because those are pretty close. So this little knob now becomes, let me see if I can get it, that we use to change the needle to the right now is set for the speed. So I'm going to move that all the way down, and that way you can almost count the stitches because that's so close. And so I'm going to hit the start stop, and then it will just do the whole series of this button. And then you can see it locks off. Now I'm going to do it again. I'm just going to hit the start stop again. Most of the time I like to do 2 just for good measure. And then I will cut. Now I need to lift my presser foot up using the back lever and then push it up even higher. You can see how it goes higher. Pull this forward so that I can slide the button out. Look how good that looks. All right, so let me, I'm going to slide this out for right now. I'm going to go ahead and take this foot off so I can put my next button on. I have one more button, and it's a cute little pumpkin. So I've got everything set up. I have my button, I have my foot back on, I have this in the little window, and I have my thread changed to kind of a yellowish orange. And now I am going to do the hand wheel. Now this looks pretty, these look like they might be farther apart, and so it barely, so either I'm going to have to do that all by hand, because I have to move this. I think I might be able to move the stitches apart. Okay, I moved on my screen. I'll show you in a minute. I moved it from, it was set default to 3.5 millimeter. I moved it to 4, and I'm going to see if that becomes wider enough. I might have to go one more. That's still pretty close, but that's much better. Okay, so I'm gonna try that. It's on the slowest speed, so I'm just going to hit the start stop, and let's see. You can see that button moving. Okay, I'm definitely going to do that one more time. I probably could have made it 4.5 millimeters, and then it wouldn't have kind of been shifting that button. But that's okay. And then I'll cut it. I'll lift my presser foot and then pull that out. And then let's take a look. So I just wanted to show you that I just moved this, the width of that, to 4 millimeters. It was, you can tell it's not default because it doesn't have a black box. And so when I changed to that stitch 90, 3.5 is this just the default typical, but because my holes were wider, I moved it up. Again, I probably could have moved it up to 4.5, and then it wouldn't have hit the very insides of those holes and kind of shifted that button back and forth, but it all worked out. All right, so here are the buttons. Here's a little pumpkin button that looks really good. The little apple, cute. And so I took half of those that I ripped and just tied it, and I'll show you how I did that. Now, I don't know if I'm going to keep them that long. I think they're a little long. I love it, but I think it might cover up too much. I'm going to go hang it first to see if it's okay. I might cut them maybe half so that really one set would have been long enough for both, but I'm going to hang it up first and see. So how I did that was just, I'm going to flip this upside down. So I have all my pieces. Let me get the right ones. And I just kind of took off the extra piece, thread that was super loose. And I'm just laying them all out. I do have one of the brown. I cut 2 really long browns, and I cut both of them in half. And so I have 2 long pieces per side. So one of those I'm going to use in with all of these first. Did I get all of them? Orange, yellow, yep. And then the second one I just took about in half. Again, these will probably be cut, and I just tied just a knot, just a square knot. Is that the right one? Did I grab the right one? Oh well. So I tied a square knot just so that I have those. And then I just took this and looped one of the sides. This is the longer side, so that's what I'm going to use. I just looped it up through the little ponytail, and then I just tied a knot. I did not tie a double knot on this one. I just tied it once, and then just let that fall in case I ever want to change it if I don't like it, or if something happens. Anyways, I thought it would be harder to figure out which one to undo, so I just tied it once. All right, so I'm gonna go figure out how much I want to cut off. I'm gonna hang it up and see how these little ponytails worked, and make sure that they're not too long. I guess it really doesn't matter, but if for some reason, let's say it stretches out too much, I could always tie a knot. But I'm going to go hang it up and see what it looks like. I love it, and I ended up not trimming any of those little strips. I ended up moving them up to cover that little ponytail holder. Now, if I were to do this again, which I probably will, if I wanted to do something instead of ties, I would not put as much sticking up as I sewed. Now I mentioned earlier that I might tie a knot to make it a little bit smaller, but they of course did stretch out quite a bit, and I didn't need nearly as much sticking out. And so I would probably maybe cut one of those in half next time and just sew them on. But I love it. It looks great. I think that those little strips just add a fun detail, and our Autumn Acres wall hanging is done.